They handed me the broom like it was an extension of my body, as though I'd been born with bristles instead of fingers. "Careful with the floors," Aunt Lorraine snapped, her diamond bracelet glinting under the chandelier. "That marble costs more than you'll ever make in your lifetime." The guests laughed. Not loud enough to be scandalous but just enough to sting. Their champagne glasses trembled with amusement, their eyes sparkling with that cruel joy rich people wear so well. And I stood there, broom in hand, in the middle of the grand hall where laughter clung to crystal walls. I was 24 years old. And to them I was nothing more than the help. Before I take you deeper into this story, let me pause and speak directly to you. Have you ever been humiliated in front of people who believed they were better than you? Have you ever swallowed shame just to keep standing? If you have, then stay with me. Because what started with a broom in my hand ended with keys to a mansion. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because trust me, you'll want to see how this revenge unfolded. The mansion belonged to the Crawfords, my mother's side of the family. Old money, the kind that stretched back generations and wore arrogance like perfume. My mother had been the rebel, the one who married for love instead of wealth. For that she was cut off, disinherited, forgotten. When she died young, all I had left was her memory and the bitterness of relatives who never forgave her for choosing beneath her. They took me in, but not as family. As staff. I polished their silver. I folded their laundry. I served them at dinners where I wasn't allowed to sit at the table. I wore black dresses that weren't uniforms but looked enough like them to make the message clear. "You'll never be more than a maid," Aunt Lorraine would say, sipping her wine. "It's in your blood." And the rest of them nodded, clinked glasses, and moved on. On the night that burned itself into me, the Crawfords were hosting one of their endless galas. Crystal chandeliers blazed like suns overhead, gowns swept across marble, and the orchestra played as if money itself were conducting. I carried trays. I cleared plates. I smiled with my lips but not my eyes. "Don't trip, girl," Uncle Martin sneered as I passed. "Though, perhaps that's all you're good for, falling at people's feet." Laughter followed him, rolling through the hall like smoke. I wanted to scream, to drop the tray and shatter every dish, every glass, every illusion of their superiority. But I didn't. I simply walked on, spine straight, steps measured. Because sometimes silence is louder than fury. Later, as I stood in the kitchen wiping down counters already gleaming, my cousin Beatrice waltzed in, tiara tilted on her curls. "You're lucky, you know," she said, eyeing her reflection in the silver. "Most people would kill to live in a mansion." I didn't look at her. "Most people don't live here as servants." She laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Servant, staff, maid, call it what you like. It suits you. You'll never be one of us." She left with a flick of perfume and arrogance, leaving me alone with the hum of the dishwasher and the echo of her words. "You'll never be one of us." But here's what they didn't understand. Every insult, every humiliation, every cruel joke was fuel. They thought they were breaking me down. What they were really doing was building me up. Because deep down, beneath the apron and the broom and the bruises pride can't cover, I knew something they didn't. I knew that life has a way of turning. And when it turned, I'd be ready. That night, after the gala ended and the guests drifted away in limousines, I walked through the empty hall alone. The chandeliers dimmed, the marble floors gleamed, and the echoes of laughter still clung to the walls. I looked around the mansion, at the portraits of Crawford's past, at the rooms stuffed with wealth, at the gardens sprawling under moonlight. And I whispered to myself, one day this won't be theirs. It was a promise. Not just to me, but to my mother, whose ghost still lingered in every corner they tried to erase her from. The Crawfords didn't know it, but that night was the beginning. The beginning of the end for them. And the beginning of a new life for me. Because when they told me I'd never be more than a maid, they handed me the script for their own downfall. And I was ready to rewrite it. People say children forget. That cruelty, when it's young enough, fades with time. They're wrong. Children don't forget. They remember everything. The tone, the smirk, the words that slice deeper than sticks and stones. They just tuck it away until they're old enough to name it. I was 8 when I first realized the Crawfords didn't see me as family. The memory is sharp, a scar I can trace even now. It was Christmas morning. Paige and Beatrice, my cousins, tore through mountains of gifts in silk wrapping, squealing over dolls with porcelain faces, dresses stitched with lace and jewelry boxes lined with velvet. When it was my turn, Aunt Lorraine handed me a box no bigger than her palm. "Here," she said, her smile thin as tissue paper. "So you don't feel left out." I opened it carefully. Inside was a used journal, pages already half filled with someone else's handwriting. I looked up at her, unsure. "Don't waste it," she said briskly. "You can practice writing in it. Maybe one day you'll be useful." The room burst into laughter. Paige clutched her doll tighter. Beatrice dangled a bracelet on her wrist, and I sat there with a second-hand journal, my cheeks burning. I didn't cry. Not then. But I wrote. Page after page I filled that journal with stories. Dreams. Secrets. And in those pages I found something they never intended to give me. A voice. My mother had been gone 2 years by then. She died young, taken by illness that money could have treated if the Crawfords had cared enough to help. But they didn't. She made her choice, Uncle Martin would say. Married a man with nothing, ended up with nothing. And by nothing, he meant me. My father tried. God, he tried. But grief swallowed him whole, and work at the docks left him too tired to fight the Crawfords' scorn. He died before I turned 15, leaving me alone in a house full of people who reminded me daily that I was an intruder. "You're lucky we even let you stay," Aunt Lorraine would hiss when I hesitated with chores. "Without us, you'd be on the streets." Lucky. That was their favorite word. They said it when I scrubbed their floors. When I polished their silver. When I cleared their plates at dinners I wasn't allowed to join. Lucky. As though survival in their shadow was a blessing. By 16 I had learned how to disappear. I moved like silence, slipped through rooms without notice. I listened. I learned. And in listening I discovered something important. The Crawfords weren't untouchable. Behind the laughter and the wealth they were riddled with cracks. Uncle Martin's gambling debts. Beatrice's habit of spending more than her allowance. Paige's lies about school and friends. Even Aunt Lorraine, queen of perfection, snapped at night when she thought no one was listening. I didn't gloat. I didn't weaponize it. Not yet. I simply stored it away brick by brick, building an invisible wall of truths no one else noticed. Because someday I knew I'd need it. There were moments, though, when the weight threatened to break me. I remember standing in the mansion garden one summer, watching Paige and Beatrice laugh with their friends by the fountain. They were radiant in sun-drenched dresses, their hair braided with ribbons. I stood apart in plain cotton, a tray of lemonade glasses sweating in my hands. Beatrice caught my eye, smirked, and whispered something to Paige. They laughed harder. In that moment I wanted to run. To vanish. To leave the mansion and never come back. But I didn't. Because deep inside, beneath the humiliation and the hunger for something better, a fire burned. I wanted to prove them wrong. Not with words. With victories they couldn't deny. At school I poured myself into learning. They didn't care about my grades, but I did. I stayed late in the library, asked teachers for extra work, memorized lessons until my eyes blurred. Why bother? Paige mocked once when she caught me reading by the staircase. "You'll never be more than a maid." I didn't answer her. But in my head I whispered, "Wait and see." By 18 I had saved enough from odd jobs around town to buy a second-hand laptop. I taught myself bookkeeping, editing, even some law basics from free courses online. Every skill was a tool. Every lesson was a weapon. And while the Crawfords thought I was wasting away in their shadow, I was sharpening myself in silence. They never noticed. They didn't care enough to look. And that was their mistake. The truth is, resilience doesn't come from being loved. It comes from surviving without it. The Crawfords thought they were burying me. But what they didn't know was that I was a seed. And one day I'd grow roots so deep they couldn't pull me out. That night after the gala, broom in hand, laughter ringing in my ears, I didn't just feel humiliated. I felt ready. Because everything they had done to keep me small had only made me stronger. And soon I would prove it. Not just to them, but to myself. Every story has a hinge. A moment so small it seems forgettable until the door it opens changes everything. For me, that hinge came on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked inside an envelope I wasn't supposed to find. I was in the study, dusting shelves lined with books no Crawford had touched in years. The room smelled of leather and polish, and the afternoon sun spilled through tall windows, lighting up motes of dust that swirled like secrets in the air. On the desk sat a stack of unopened mail. Normally, I would tidy it without question, sliding envelopes into neat piles for Aunt Lorraine to ignore until the mood struck her. But one envelope caught my eye. It was thick, official-looking, stamped with the seal of a law office I vaguely recognized from town. My hand hesitated above it, curiosity clawing at me. I told myself I shouldn't. That I'd be scolded if caught. That maids don't pry. But daughters who have been disinherited? Daughters who have swallowed humiliation their whole lives? They don't look away from locked doors. They find keys. I slipped the letter free and scanned the words. Estate review, will in question. Inheritance under reconsideration. My pulse quickened. Inheritance. Whose? I read again, slower this time. The letter mentioned my grandfather. A man I barely remembered, stern and silent, who died when I was 5. His estate had been divided decades ago, but apparently some part of it was under dispute. Assets unaccounted for. Property unsettled. And then I saw my mother's name. My heart stopped. My mother, the rebel Crawford who had been erased from family records, cut off for daring to love a man without money. She had been left something. And no one had ever told me. I folded the letter back into the envelope, hands trembling. My mind raced. Why hadn't they mentioned this? Why had they hidden it? Because it was mine. And they didn't want me to know. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my narrow bed beneath the servants' quarters roof, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling, the envelope burning in my mind. What did the inheritance mean? Money? Land? Something else? It didn't matter. Whatever it was mine by right. And if they had lied about this for years, what else had they hidden? I realized then that my mother hadn't been erased. She had been silenced. And the Crawfords had been the ones pressing the mute button. But silence doesn't last forever. The next morning I made my decision. I tucked the letter into my apron pocket and walked to the law office on my lunch break. My heart pounded as I pushed through the heavy oak doors, the receptionist raising an eyebrow at my plain black dress. I need to speak with whoever handles Crawford estate matters, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Minutes later, I sat across from a man in a tailored suit, his glasses perched low on his nose as he flipped through files. And you are? He asked without looking up. Sasha Quinn, I said. Daughter of Margaret Crawford. His eyes snapped to mine. Surprise flickered there, then something sharper. I see, he murmured. The conversation that followed changed my life. Yes, my mother had been written out of the Crawford fortune. But she had still been legally entitled to part of her father's estate. Property, specifically. A mansion on the edge of town, long forgotten, left to her in his original will. The Crawfords had fought it, of course. They claimed she had forfeited it when she married my father. But the law wasn't on their side. The property had remained in limbo all these years, tied up in disputes they hoped I'd never discover. Till now. The lawyer leaned back, studying me. Technically, Miss Quinn, that mansion belongs to you. It has for years. The paperwork just needs to be finalized. The room spun. Why? Not theirs. Why? I walked out of that office with more than documents. I walked out with power. For the first time in my life, I held something the Crawfords couldn't take from me. Something they didn't even know I had. A mansion. Their currency. Their crown jewel. The very thing they had always used to remind me I was less than them. And now it was mine. I didn't rush to tell them. Not yet. Because revenge, I realized, wasn't about speed. It was about timing. The Crawfords had mocked me for years in that grand house, parading their wealth while I scrubbed their floors. So when I revealed the truth, it wouldn't be in whispers. It would be in echoes. Loud enough to shake the marble. Loud enough to silence every sneer. Loud enough that they'd never forget who I really was. Not a maid. Not a shadow. But the rightful heir to the life they tried to steal. And soon they'd learn. Not in private. But in front of everyone who had ever laughed at me. Because when you're served humiliation, the only way to return it is on a silver platter. And I was ready to serve mine. Power doesn't fall into your hands all at once. It trickles. It gathers. It builds like a storm swelling on the horizon until one day the sky splits. After I left the lawyer's office, clutching documents that named me as the rightful heir, I felt that storm humming beneath my skin. But I knew better than to unleash it immediately. The Crawfords had spent their lives teaching me patience. And now I'd use that lesson against them. I returned to the mansion as though nothing had changed. I scrubbed floors. I polished banisters. I cleared their plates while they laughed at me. But inside I laughed too. Because every sneer, every insult, every command was a debt they didn't know they were paying me back with interest. "You missed a spot," Aunt Lorraine would snap. "Clumsy girl," Uncle Martin muttered when I brushed past him with a tray. Beatrice smirked at my plain clothes. Paige wrinkled her nose when I entered a room, and through it all I thought, if only you knew. But while I wore the mask of the maid, the Crawfords' own masks began to crack. Uncle Martin's gambling, once whispered about, became impossible to hide. Creditors began calling at the house, their voices sharp and demanding through the receiver. I caught fragments of arguments, Lorraine's shrill scolding, Martin's desperate promises. Beatrice, desperate to maintain her lavish lifestyle, begged her mother for more money, flaunting credit cards already near their limits. And Paige, perfect Paige, the jewel of the Crawfords, found herself engaged to a wealthy banker, but the shine of her lies wore thin. I overheard late-night phone calls, whispered fights with her fiancé, accusations she brushed off with brittle laughter. The Crawfords were crumbling. And they didn't even see it. I started making quiet moves of my own. At the lawyer's advice, I began transferring the mansion's deeds and paperwork into my name. Slowly, carefully, so as not to raise suspicion. Each signature, each notarized stamp, was a step closer to the reveal. At night, in my tiny servant's room, I studied contracts and property laws by lamplight. I wanted to understand every clause, every loophole. I wouldn't just inherit the mansion, I'd own it body and soul. And in those long nights, hunched over papers with ink smudging my fingers, I realized something important. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was reclamation. The Crawfords had built their arrogance on a foundation that was never truly theirs. It was my mother's. And by extension mine. Weeks passed. I kept working in the mansion, my silence sharper than any retort. But little things changed. I stood taller. I looked them in the eyes instead of lowering mine. I answered with calm, measured words instead of flinching. And they noticed. "What's gotten into you?" Aunt Lorraine demanded one morning, glaring as I poured coffee. "You're smug lately." "Nothing," I replied with a small smile. "Just looking forward to the future." She scoffed, but unease flickered in her eyes. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking under her gaze. The Crawfords' grand galas became fewer. Their circle of friends grew tighter. Gossip trickled into the hallways. Whispers that the family was struggling. Whispers that debts were piling. Whispers that the shine was wearing off. And through it all they still clung to their pride, still mocked me, still treated me as the maid. But inside I no longer felt like a servant. I felt like a queen in disguise. Then came the night that sealed it. A dinner party, smaller than usual but still dripping with pretense. Crystal glasses, heavy silverware, conversations about stocks and holidays they couldn't afford but pretended they could. I was serving soup when Beatrice, emboldened by wine, smirked at me. "You know, Sasha," she said loudly so the table would hear, "if you're lucky maybe one of us will hire you full-time when you're older. You'd make a decent nanny. Or perhaps a cook. Something useful." Laughter bubbled around the table. I set the soup down gently, my hands steady. Then I leaned just enough to meet her eyes. "Funny," I said softly. "Because one day soon I'll be the one deciding who stays in this house. And who leaves." The laughter faltered. "What did you say?" Lorraine demanded. "Nothing," I replied with a smile. "Just looking forward to the future." I walked out of the room, leaving their confusion behind me. But inside I knew the truth. The storm was almost here. By the end of that month the paperwork was complete. The mansion was mine. Legally. Irrevocably. The Crawfords still paraded their false wealth, still barked orders, still believed they reigned over me. But I had the keys. The papers. The law. And soon everyone, not just the Crawfords, would know it. Because revenge tastes best not in secrecy but in spectacle. And I was ready to serve it in front of an audience. The night of the reveal was not an accident. I chose it carefully down to the last candle. The Crawfords were hosting their biggest gala of the season, desperate to prove to their dwindling circle of friends that they were still the empire they once claimed to be. The invitations had gone out weeks before, the guest list glittered with names that carried weight, and the chandeliers were polished until they shone like suns. I let them prepare. I let them believe. I let them dress themselves in arrogance one last time. Because when the curtain fell, I wanted the audience to be large. The house was alive with music and chatter. Guests in gowns and tuxedos swirled across the marble floors, sipping champagne, laughing too loudly, pretending not to notice the undercurrent of gossip that trailed the Crawfords these days. I moved through the hall as I always had, tray in hand, head bowed just enough to remind them of who they thought I was. The maid. The shadow. The nobody. But tonight I carried more than glasses. I carried the truth. Near the end of the evening, when the orchestra softened and the speeches began, Aunt Lorraine rose to her feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her pearls gleaming, "thank you for joining us tonight. It is always a joy to remind our friends of the Crawford legacy, a legacy of wealth, honor, and—" I stepped forward. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through the music like a blade. Every head turned. Lorraine's smile faltered. "What are you doing, girl? Get back to the kitchen." I didn't move. Instead, I walked to the center of the hall, heels clicking against marble, the tray set gently on a table as I passed. My heart thundered, but my voice was steady. "I think it's time everyone here knew the truth," I said. A murmur rippled through the guests. Paige rolled her eyes. Beatrice smirked. Uncle Martin scoffed. But I kept going. For years, I've been told I'd never be more than a maid. That my place was here, serving, cleaning, invisible. But what none of you knew, what they never wanted you to know, is that this mansion isn't theirs. The room stilled. "It's mine." Gasps erupted. A glass shattered somewhere. The orchestra fell silent. Lorraine's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Yours? Don't be absurd. This house has been in our family for generations." "Exactly," I replied. "Which is why my grandfather left it to my mother, Margaret Crawford, in his will. You remember her, don't you? The daughter you erased because she married for love instead of money?" Faces shifted. Some guests nodded, recalling the scandal. Others whispered. I pulled the documents from my bag, unfolding them with deliberate calm. "Here are the deeds. The signatures. The court rulings. This mansion has been mine by law for years. And as of last month, all paperwork has been finalized." I held up the stamped certificate, the Crawford crest still visible in the watermark. Gasps turned to stunned silence. Paige leapt to her feet, her face flushed. "This is ridiculous. You're nothing. You've always been nothing." "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "I've always been more than you were willing to see." Beatrice sputtered. "This is a trick. A forgery." "Feel free to call the lawyer yourself," I replied smoothly. "In fact, he's here tonight." Gasps again as the lawyer I'd befriended stepped forward from the crowd. He nodded solemnly. "She's telling the truth. This property belongs to Miss Sasha Quinn." The Crawfords' empire crumbled in real time. Lorraine's mask cracked. Her voice, once dripping with control, now shook. "You can't do this. We've lived here all our lives. And I cleaned up after you, all mine," I said evenly. "The difference is you lived here on borrowed pride. I live here by right." Murmurs spread. The guests, once enraptured by the Crawfords' wealth, now looked at them with new eyes, not as royalty but as frauds. I turned slowly, addressing the room. For years I was humiliated in this hall. Mocked, belittled, told to eat scraps while the Crawfords feasted. But tonight I stand here not as their servant, not as their shame, but as the rightful owner of this mansion. And from this day forward, the Crawfords are no longer masters of this house. The silence that followed was deafening. Then one by one guests began to clap. Not all, but enough. Enough to shift the air, enough to tell the Crawfords that their reign of cruelty was over. Paige screamed. Beatrice fled the room in tears. Uncle Martin stormed out, muttering about debts and conspiracies. Lorraine stood frozen, her pearls trembling against her chest. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I smiled. "No. I regret nothing." That night, when the guests had gone and the chandeliers dimmed, I walked the halls alone. For the first time, the mansion felt different. It wasn't gilded prison bars anymore. It was mine. I paused beneath my grandfather's portrait, the man whose will had been twisted and hidden, and whispered, "She got it, Mama. We got it back." And for the first time in years I felt whole. The Crawfords had mocked me for being the maid. But the maid had become the master. And their empire had fallen, not with fire, but with a single truth revealed under crystal chandeliers. The morning after the gala, the mansion felt like a different place. The same chandeliers hung overhead, the same marble gleamed beneath my feet, the same portraits stared down from the walls. But for the first time in my life, the house didn't feel like it was watching me. Felt like it was listening. The Crawfords were scattered in the drawing room, their faces gray and tight from a night of humiliation. Lorraine sat stiffly in an armchair, her pearls askew. Paige paced in her wrinkled gown, her hair falling loose from its perfect curls. Beatrice clung to her phone, scrolling furiously as though social media might rewrite the truth. I walked in slowly, the sound of my heels echoing on the marble. No tray in my hand. No apron tied around my waist. Just me. And the silence that now belonged to me. Lorraine was the first to speak. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her voice low and brittle. "This house, it's not just walls. It's our legacy." "No," I replied calmly. "It's my legacy. You spent years pretending my mother never existed, but she was a Crawford. This house was hers. And now it's mine." Paige whirled on me, her eyes wild. "You'll never belong here. You may have the papers, but you'll never be one of us." I smiled. "I don't need to be one of you. That's the point." The weight of their silence pressed down on them. They weren't used to being powerless, to having no cards left to play. Beatrice finally whispered, "So, what happens to us?" I let the question hang, savoring it. For years that had been my question. Where did I belong? What would happen to me when they were done mocking me? Would I be cast out with nothing? Now the roles had reversed. "What happens to you," I said, "is up to me." Lorraine's mask cracked then. The woman who had sneered down at me my entire life leaned forward, desperation bleeding through her voice. "Please. You can't put us out on the street. We've nowhere to go." The irony nearly made me laugh. How many times had she told me I was lucky she let me stay? How many times had she dangled the threat of the streets over my head like a guillotine? "Funny," I said softly. "I seem to remember you saying those exact words to me." Her face went pale. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. Revenge didn't need volume. It needed precision. "You'll stay," I said finally, "but not as masters. Not as hosts. You'll stay here on my terms. Every room, every corner, every chandelier. It answers to me now. And you will too." Paige gasped. Beatrice whimpered. Lorraine closed her eyes. I let the silence do the rest. In the days that followed, the Crawfords learned what it meant to live without power. They no longer commanded me to serve them. I hired staff of my own, people I paid fairly, people who looked me in the eye. Lorraine flinched when maids walked past her. Paige stopped hosting luncheons when no one came. Beatrice, once the princess of the ballroom, hid in her room when her credit cards were declined. And through it all, I walked the mansion with quiet dignity. The weight of humiliation finally lifted. People in town talked, of course. Whispers spread like wildfire. The Crawfords had fallen. The Maid had risen. The mansion now belonged to the girl they had once mocked. But I didn't chase the gossip. I didn't need to. Because the sweetest revenge wasn't in the whispers of others. It was in the silence that filled the halls each time I entered a room. It was in the way the Crawfords lowered their eyes when they passed me. It was in the knowledge that they lived every day in a house that no longer belonged to them. One evening, I stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, the sunset painting the sky in gold and crimson. For years, I had stared out at those gardens carrying trays and empty plates. Now I stood there with nothing in my hands but freedom. I thought of my mother then. Of the woman who had chosen love over wealth, who had been erased for it. "I brought it back, Mama," I whispered into the evening air. "They couldn't keep it from us." The wind carried my words through the roses, soft and steady. And for the first time I felt her pride. The Crawfords had told me I'd never be more than a maid. But in the end, the maid had become the master. Not with cruelty. Not with arrogance. But with truth, patience, and the quiet kind of revenge that lingers long after the chandeliers go dark. And every time I walked the halls of my mansion I smiled. Because the echo of their sneers had finally been replaced by the silence of my victory.